You are standing in the shadows of the Forbidden City on a bitter winter morning in 1421 AD. The air cuts through your thin cotton robes like frozen daggers, and your bare feet have long since lost feeling against the ice-covered stones. Through the vermilion gates, you can hear the distant sound of ceremonial bells echoing across the vast courtyards, calling the imperial court to morning audiences with the Son of Heaven himself. But you will never answer those bells. You will never walk freely through those golden halls or speak in the presence of the dragon throne. Because 3 days ago, in a cramped hovel on the outskirts of Beijing, your childhood ended forever beneath a rusty blade wielded by trembling hands. Your name was once Liu Wei, and you were 8 years old when your father sold you for the price of a winter's worth of grain. Now you are nothing, less than nothing. You are a creature caught between worlds, neither fully male nor female, neither truly alive nor completely dead. The wound between your legs throbs with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of what was taken from you in exchange for the slim possibility of power within these crimson walls. The bandages wrapped around your groin are already stained brown with dried blood and yellow with infection, but you dare not complain. Complaint means death, and death might actually be preferable to what awaits you in the years ahead. Welcome to the nightmare world of Imperial China's palace eunuchs, where thousands of boys were mutilated in the name of serving an emperor they would never truly know, in a system so brutal it makes medieval torture chambers look like acts of mercy. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The creation of palace eunuchs was not an accident of history or a byproduct of war. It was a deliberate, calculated system of human modification designed to create the perfect servant class for China's imperial dynasties. For over 2,000 years, from the Qin dynasty through the fall of the Qing in 1912, Chinese emperors surrounded themselves with castrated men who could never threaten the imperial bloodline, never father children who might claim the throne, and never form the family loyalties that could challenge imperial authority. But the true horror of this system was not just in its cruelty, but in its scale. Conservative estimates suggest that over the course of Chinese imperial history, more than 1 million boys were castrated to serve in various imperial palaces. Most died within days of the procedure. Those who survived faced lives of unimaginable suffering, caught in a world that viewed them as neither fully human nor entirely expendable. The process began in the poorest villages across the Chinese countryside, where families faced an impossible choice between watching their children starve or selling them into a system that would mutilate them beyond recognition. The buyers were not palace officials, but independent operators who understood the economics of human suffering. They would arrive in farming villages during the worst famines, offering desperate parents just enough silver to survive another season in exchange for their youngest sons. These merchants of human flesh were called knife specialists, and they operated in a grey area between legal commerce and criminal enterprise. The imperial court needed eunuchs, but could never officially sanction the castration of children, so they relied on these middlemen who would purchase boys, perform the surgery, and then sell the survivors to palace officials who could claim ignorance about how their servants had lost their manhood. The selection process was as calculating as it was heartless. The knife specialist looked for boys between the ages of 6 and 12, young enough that the castration would heal properly, but old enough to survive the trauma and begin basic training. They preferred children from families with no political connections, no wealth, and no ability to seek revenge if something went wrong. Orphans were ideal, but desperate parents would suffice. Physical appearance mattered enormously. The specialists sought boys who might grow into attractive men Understanding that beauty was often the only path to advancement within the palace hierarchy, they examined bone structure, skin quality, and overall health with the same attention livestock traders gave to prize animals. Because that is exactly what these children had become, valuable livestock whose worth was determined by their potential to please imperial masters. Once purchased, the boys entered a nightmare that would make modern human trafficking operations seem restrained by comparison. They were transported in cramped wagons to specialized facilities on the outskirts of Beijing, where the actual castration would take place. These facilities were not medical clinics, but crude workshops where human anatomy was modified with the same tools used to slaughter pigs. The castration itself was performed without anesthetic, antiseptic, or any concern for the victim's survival beyond the immediate economic investment. The knife specialist would use a sharp blade, often a razor or small knife, to remove both the testicles and penis in a single cutting motion. The wound was then sealed with a metal plug or wooden peg to prevent the urethra from closing completely, allowing the boy to urinate if he survived the initial trauma. The mortality rate was staggering. Historical records suggest that between 60 and 80% of boys died within the first week after castration, succumbing to blood loss, infection, or shock. Those who survived faced weeks of agony as their bodies struggled to heal from the deliberate mutilation. They were kept in dark, unventilated rooms, lying on straw mats soaked with their own blood and waste, attended only by other eunuchs who had survived the same ordeal years or decades earlier. The psychological trauma was as devastating as the physical wounds. These children had been torn from their families, mutilated by strangers, and thrust into a world where their very existence depended on the whims of people who viewed them as objects rather than human beings. Many went mad during the recovery period, screaming endlessly or retreating into catatonic silence. Others developed elaborate fantasies about their former lives, or convinced themselves that their families would somehow rescue them. But rescue never came. The families who had sold these boys could never afford to buy them back, and even if they could, the imperial system would never allow it. Once a boy entered the eunuch system, he belonged to the emperor until death. There was no escape, no appeal, no hope of ever returning to the world beyond the palace walls. Those who survived the initial castration and recovery period faced a different kind of hell as they began their training for palace service. They were taught to walk, speak, and behave in ways that would please their imperial masters, while constantly reminded that their lives held no intrinsic value beyond their utility to the throne. The training regimen for surviving eunuch boys was designed to strip away every trace of their former identity and rebuild them as perfect instruments of imperial service. They were assigned new names, usually reflecting their low status or the circumstances of their arrival. Liu Wei became simply number 43 or the one who weeps too much, until even those designations were forgotten in favor of whatever title their eventual master chose to bestow. The educational process began with the most basic survival skills. Boys who had grown up running freely through village streets now had to learn to walk properly on feet that had been deliberately bound and compressed to create the mincing gait considered appropriate for palace servants. They practiced for hours each day, balancing books on their heads while taking the tiny, shuffling steps that would mark them as eunuchs for the rest of their lives. Language training was equally brutal. Their natural speaking voices were systematically altered through exercises designed to produce the high-pitched, artificially feminine tones that palace protocol demanded. Boys who spoke in their natural voices were beaten until they learned to modulate every word, every syllable, into the sing-song cadence that would identify them as castrated servants rather than whole men. But the most devastating aspect of their training was the systematic destruction of their capacity for human connection. They were forbidden to speak about their families, their former lives, or their feelings about what had been done to them. Any expression of grief, anger, or longing for their lost childhoods was met with severe punishment. They learned to smile while being humiliated, to express gratitude for their mutilation, and to compete viciously with other eunuchs for the smallest scraps of imperial favor. The palace hierarchy among eunuchs was as complex and ruthless as any system of oppression ever devised. At the bottom were the newly castrated boys, barely alive and completely powerless. Above them were the junior eunuchs who had survived their first few years and learned to navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics. At the top were the senior eunuchs who had somehow managed to gain the trust and favor of imperial family members, wielding power that could determine the fate of entire provinces. This hierarchy created a system where the victims of castration became the perpetuators of the same violence that had destroyed their own lives. Senior eunuchs would often be the cruelest masters to newly arrived boys, perhaps because seeing their former selves reflected in these broken children was too painful to bear. They would devise elaborate punishments for minor infractions, sexual humiliations that reminded everyone of their shared castration, and psychological torments that ensured no eunuch ever forgot his place in the imperial order. The daily life of a palace eunuch was a carefully orchestrated performance of servitude designed to reinforce their status as less than human. They rose before dawn to prepare for their master's needs, spending hours arranging clothing, preparing meals, and maintaining the elaborate ceremonies that surrounded every aspect of imperial life. They were expected to anticipate desires before they were expressed, to remain invisible unless specifically summoned, and to accept blame for any mishap that occurred within their sphere of responsibility. Their living quarters reflected their status as valuable property rather than human beings. Eunuchs were housed in cramped dormitories with minimal privacy, sleeping on hard wooden platforms covered only by thin mats. They were fed just enough to maintain their strength for service, with their diet carefully regulated to prevent them from becoming too strong or too healthy. The message was clear. They existed solely to serve, and any comfort they enjoyed was a privilege that could be revoked at any moment. The sexual dimensions of eunuch life were particularly grotesque, representing perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of their existence. While castration was supposed to eliminate sexual desire and capability, the reality was far more complex and disturbing. Many eunuchs retained some sexual function, and this was exploited by palace officials who used them as sexual servants in ways that would have been impossible with intact men. The final decades of the eunuch system, lasting into the early 20th century, saw these practices continue even as the outside world began to recognize their barbarity. Foreign observers who gained access to the imperial palace wrote shocked accounts of the eunuch quarters, describing grown men who had been so psychologically damaged by their treatment that they behaved like broken children, alternately servile and vindictive, desperate for approval, yet incapable of forming genuine human relationships. When the last Chinese emperor was finally deposed in 1912, thousands of elderly eunuchs found themselves cast out from the only world they had ever known as adults. Most had no families to return to, no skills applicable to life outside the palace walls, and no understanding of how to function in a society that viewed them as relics of a barbaric past. Many died of starvation or suicide within months of the imperial system's collapse, their lives ending as tragically as they had begun in those knife specialists' workshops decades earlier. The legacy of China's palace eunuch system stands as one of history's most systematic examples of institutionalized cruelty, a reminder that the pursuit of absolute power often requires the complete dehumanization of those who serve it. The boys who entered those vermilion gates as children emerged as something else entirely, their humanity sacrificed on the altar of imperial paranoia and dynastic preservation. Today, as you walk through the restored halls of the Forbidden City, now a museum celebrating China's imperial heritage. Remember that these golden corridors once echoed with the footsteps of castrated servants whose childhoods were stolen for the convenience of emperors who have been dead for centuries. Their suffering has been sanitized by time and tourism, but their stories remain as a testament to the price some human beings have always been willing to pay to maintain power over others. The knife specialists are long gone, their workshops demolished, their techniques forgotten. But the children they mutilated in service to imperial authority deserve to be remembered not as historical curiosities, but as victims of a system so brutal that it challenges our understanding of what human beings are capable of inflicting upon each other in the name of tradition, power, and the supposed divine right of kings.